Why on earth do people enjoy things? Hello, my name is Kevin, and welcome to the first episode of the Tales Around the Fire podcast. With me and many others here to ask one single question: why on earth do people enjoy things such as urban legends, cryptids, or even creepypastas? Well, here today, I have three stories here to talk about. This very first story I have is called The Omen's Trail. I have not heard of this story once in my life. This was made and posted by Dice Dungeon and was found right on Reddit. Detective work often treads the fine line between logic and the unexplainable. Facts are gathered, conclusions drawn, and yet every so often, something slips through the cracks of reason. This is the tale of Detective Victor Craddock, a man who prided himself on his sharp mind and unshakable skepticism, traits that would be put to the ultimate test. The name Craddock is not unfamiliar to me, nor to those who recall the darker histories of their families. Bartholomew Craddock's tragic tale of greed and hubris left a stain upon his lineage, though Victor preferred to think of himself as the man who could redeem the name. Yet, even he could not foresee the shadows that awaited him in a small, cursed neighborhood. Victor Craddock had seen plenty in his career, from grisly murders to convoluted fraud schemes, but when he was called to investigate a string of bizarre deaths in a quiet suburban neighborhood, he knew something about this case was different. The victims ranged in age and circumstance. A teenager electrocuted while gaming in his room, an elderly woman crushed by her collapsing shed, a jogger run over by a driverless car, all seemingly unrelated accidents, yet one detail tied them together: an albino cat spotted near the scene every time. Victor's partner on the case, Detective James Monroe, was a stark contrast to them. Where Victor clung to reason, James reveled in folklore and superstition. "It's the omen," James said one afternoon, flipping through an old tattered book of urban legends. "The albino cat that heralds death. Stories of it go back centuries, even millennia. Cavemen painted it on their walls. Roman scribes mentioned it, and even today there are reports of it tied to fatal accidents worldwide." Victor rolled his eyes. "An albino cat is a coincidence, not a cause." James leaned forward, his expression serious. "You don't believe in curses, but what if it's not the cat itself? What if it's some force tied to it? Something that brings death wherever it goes?" Victor dismissed the idea, but couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The investigation led the two detectives to a series of strange accounts from the neighbors. A retired teacher recalled feeding the cat one evening, only to trip and break her hip moments later. A landscaper swore he'd seen it, watching him just before his coworker's mower exploded. A delivery driver mentioned nearly hitting the cat before veering into a ditch. "The cat is real," Victor admitted, though begrudgingly, "but it's just an animal." That night, Victor decided to stake out the neighborhood, hoping to observe the mysterious feline. James, of course, joined him, carrying a bag of salt and a silver cross. His precautions, he called them. They waited in silence for hours, parked in Victor's car on the street. The wind howled, and the occasional flicker of a street lamp cast eerie shadows across the road. At midnight, they saw it. The albino cat was almost spectral in appearance, its snow-white fur gleaming under the moonlight. It moved with an unnatural grace, its crimson eyes glowing faintly. It stopped in front of a house, stared at the window, and then vanished into the bushes. Moments later, the sound of shattering glass filled the air. Victor and James rushed toward the house, finding a man sprawled on the floor of his living room. A heavy bookshelf had toppled over, pinning him beneath it. "He's alive," James said, pulling the man free. Victor scanned the room, his heart racing. The cat was nowhere to be found. The pattern repeated over the next few nights. Wherever the cat appeared, disaster followed. Victor's skepticism wavered, though he refused to admit it outright. "It's not magic," he insisted. "There has to be a logical explanation. Maybe the cat's movements are spooking people, causing them to act recklessly." James wasn't convinced. "What about the accidents? It couldn't possibly influence, like the jogger and the driverless car." Victor had no answer. Their investigation came to a head when they tracked the cat to an abandoned lot at the edge of town. The lot was overgrown with weeds, and in its center stood a crumbling stone pillar etched with strange symbols. Victor felt a chill as he examined the pillar. This isn't normal. It's older than this town, James said. Maybe older than civilization itself. What if this is the cat's anchor, its connection to our world? Before Victor could respond, the cat appeared, perched atop the pillar. It stared at them with its crimson eyes, unblinking. Victor raised his flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. The cat didn't move. What do we do? He asked. James hesitated. Destroy the pillar. Using a crowbar from the car, they smashed the pillar to rubble. With each blow, the air grew heavier, and a low, almost imperceptible hum filled their ears. When the pillar finally collapsed, the cat let out an ear-piercing screech. Its form shimmered, twisted, and then dissolved into nothingness. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving the two detectives gasping for breath. It's over, James said, though his voice was shaky. Victor wasn't so sure. The strange deaths stopped, and the neighborhood returned to normal. But Victor couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't defeated the cat, only banished it. Months later, he received an anonymous package containing a photograph of an albino cat sitting atop a similar stone pillar. The location was unrecognizable, but the message was clear. The omen was still out there, waiting for its next chapter. Victor Craddock learned that some mysteries cannot be solved, only survived. He faced a fragment of the unknown and lived to tell the tale, but the omen is eternal, a force that has walked beside humanity since the dawn of time. Beware the pale cat, for where it treads, death follows. And if you don't, then I, the witness, will know your next story. Did I learn anything that came from this? Albino cats are apparently evil. My initial thoughts when heading into the story, I had no clue what was going to happen. The only thing that I knew of was that... Actually, I didn't know about anything. All I know is that it was about an omen, which omens usually are a certain, I guess a foreshadowing of upcoming events. Maybe the cat itself was a personification of upcoming events. In this case, a disaster. Here we have our second story. A story with a character that I'm very familiar with within the whole area expertise of creepypastas, and that is Zalgo. I personally have zero clue on what the origin of Zalgo is. All I know is that there was this thing called Zalgo text, which in messages it just shows the text, but a lot more corrupted, and that's usually what is known as the Zalgo text. And then there are also the Zalgo comic strips, which, from what I'm understanding, it shows an entity of chaos and malicious intent, corrupting comic strips. I personally don't know. But here we go into He Comes Zalgo. Made and posted by Chris Phoenix and uploaded to creepypasta.com. Forgive the length of this message. This is the first and possibly the last time I'll have access to a computer. So I thought I'd better write this all down while I can and get it to those who should know. I'm leaving town. I don't know where I'm going. I'm just getting as far away as I can. Okay, so, as some of you may know, I took out a loan and opened my own auto shop a little over a year ago. Business has been going decently well. I can't complain. And I've always been grateful to all of my customers who would come to me exclusively, when God knows there are so many already established places in town. I've been doing well enough that I was able to hire on my buddy Neil a few months ago, and he's been working hard and helping out really well, as I always knew he would. Well, I needed to take a day and go to a math class with Rebecca last month, and so I entrusted the shop to Neil for the morning and most of the afternoon. That's the day I think everything actually started. Because when I got back, he seemed to be in a stupor and was covered in oil. He'd even had some smeared across his face, as if he tried to drink it or something. I told him to go home and clean himself up, because we had no clients at the moment, and I could take care of anyone who came in for the time being. He came back 45 minutes later, but he was still much quieter than usual. He worked as well as he ever did, but something just seemed so off about him. I asked him if anything happened while I was out, and he just shook his head. I asked how many clients we had, and he just muttered something unintelligible. I asked him to repeat himself, and he turned and glared at me, and for the briefest moment, I could have sworn his eyes appeared to be completely black. No iris, no sclera, just utter, all-consuming blackness. I stumbled back and bumped a shelf, knocking things down. When I looked back at him, he was still looking at me, but he didn't seem to be glaring hatefully the way he had before. He just seemed kind of out of it. Just a couple, he answered. Some woman, and then a tattooed biker-type looking dude. I assumed one of them must have asked for an oil change, and that's when he spilled it. So I asked if he had any trouble, and he simply shrugged. I had looked around the garage while he was gone, and I saw no traces of an oil spill. So whatever had happened, he must have gotten all over himself and none of it anywhere else, miraculously. But he seemed reluctant to talk about it, so I didn't press the issue, and we worked on throughout the day. That day and the next were relatively normal, other than him still being awkward and quiet. I asked him if he'd like to go out and get us lunch while I attended to the shop, and he said sure. When he came back, I was doing a diagnostic for a client, so he put the food on the counter in the office to wait for me, and he went ahead and ate. I finished up with that customer. We'd have to keep her car overnight to figure out just why it kept dying on her, so I asked Neil to give her a ride home, and then I went to grab my food. He brought me some Chinese food and a nice tea, so I opened the soy sauce packets to pour some over my food, when I noticed the strangest thing. It was as if the soy sauce was a living thing somehow, spreading out like dozens of squirming, inky black maggots when it fell into the fried rice and burying itself inside. I took the fork and started to scoop out the rice to look deeper inside, and saw small smoky tendrils would rise from the rice, occasionally, and dissipate. I was incredibly hungry at that point, but I was way too creeped out to eat that, so I chucked it in the iced tea in the garbage, and decided I'd just wait till I got home that evening to eat something I prepared with my own hands. I'd never in my life seen anything remotely like that, and I couldn't even fathom how I would ask Neil if he noticed anything similar. As cold and distant as he's been lately, I was sure he'd look at me like I was Looney Tunes, so I just shut up about it. That Friday, we went down to the old watering hole, as we always do, to get some drinks and watch the local bands play. And Neil was just as quiet and distant as he'd been all week. He's not a bad-looking fellow, though, and so despite him not really going out of his way to speak to anyone, a woman went over to where he was sitting and started talking to him, and they ended up leaving together that night. Monday morning, I tried breaking the ice by asking how his weekend went. He gave me a nod and muttered, "All right." I asked him if he got lucky with that young woman I saw him with, and he gave me the smallest grin, which was quite possibly the first grin I'd seen on his face in a week, and said it went well. I didn't pressure him for details. I knew he'd share if he chose to, and his small grin was enough to assuage my worries and lend me some hope that he might get back to his old self soon. The day was relatively busy until 3 p.m., so I finally had a spare moment to sit in the office and listen to the radio while I waited on the next client. So there I was, leaning back in my chair with my feet propped up on my desk when I swiveled around and looked at my bulletin board that sits behind my head, and all the manner of clippings stuck to it. I had a few Sunday comic strips, such as Garfield and Calvin and Hobbes, that I read maybe 100 times since I opened shop there, but that day something was different. The first panel seemed normal, but in each subsequent panel, inky black tendrils crept out from the edges of the frame, and from behind the characters, blood dripped from the ears and eyes, and sometimes even their noses. And in each of the strips, one of the characters would say, "He comes." I sat staring in astonishment for a moment before I realized the tendrils moving ever so slowly and then reached the characters' heads, turned ever so slowly towards me, and I threw myself back from the bulletin board. Sliding over my desk and onto the floor, I ran out into the garage and yelled for Neil. I could not be the only one to see this. To my surprise, he had gone, and so I hesitantly walked back to the office and peered inside. The comics were still corrupted, but they no longer appeared to be moving. I crept over to it and reached out to pluck one of the comics free, when I noticed the inky black tendrils starting to seep across the page towards where my fingers were, at least 3 times as fast as they moved before, and I jerked my hand away. Nothing good could possibly come from letting that blot of ink touch my skin. Of course, I ripped the entire bulletin board down, burned it in a tin trash can out back, and never spoke of it again. That night, I went home, and my wife was already in bed, fast asleep. My mind was racing, and I couldn't even bring myself to eat dinner that night. With no one to vent my worries to, I fell into a restless sleep, and kept awaking to nightmare after nightmare, seemingly every hour of the night, until I just gave up on sleep entirely. That Friday, I went to the bar again, even though my wife couldn't drink, being pregnant and all. And Neil wasn't really any fun to hang out with anymore, and none of my other friends could seem to be reached. I just needed to get a good buzz, and I'd start feeling better, I reckoned. After downing a couple beers, I excused myself to the restroom, when I noticed I was more inebriated than I had estimated. So I leaned over the sink to splash some water onto my face, and that's when I heard it. Like a sheet of fabric being dragged across a floor, a voice rasped ever so quietly out of the drain. It sounded like a prolonged exhale for the longest time, until I finally recognized words hidden amongst all those vowels. He comes. Cracks appeared in the porcelain, snaking out from the ring around the drain. At least, they looked like cracks at first, but after a few seconds, I recognized them as the same tendrils of corruption I'd seen in the comics earlier that week, snaking their way slowly along. I stumbled backwards out of the bathroom door and right into someone's chest. I turned around and stared up into the pitch-black eyes of a 6.5-foot biker with tattoos covering every piece of exposed skin besides his hands and head. I stumbled quickly away from him, and his evil, piercing gaze followed me as I retreated through the bar. It felt like a dream, where whenever you're running for your life, it feels like running through quicksand. As I walked across the room, I noticed the biker wasn't the only one staring at me. It seemed every pair of eyes in the place were focused on me, and more than half of those eyes appeared to be perfectly black, with no hint of iris or sclera. A few lips moved, and though I couldn't hear their voices over the sound of the jukebox, I could easily guess what they were saying. He comes. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night. I haven't been getting much sleep for the past couple of weeks. As a matter of fact, which I'm guessing those of you who've spoken to me recently could have guessed, I keep seeing those pitch-black eyes staring at me. I'm afraid everyone I see will turn and whisper those words to me, staring deep into my soul with that evil glare. Every time I go near a sink or go to grab a bite to eat, I'm afraid I'll see those inky, snaking tendrils squiggling towards me. Even my wife has seemed cold and distant lately. Then, tonight, as I'm driving home from work, struggling to keep my eyes open so that I don't drift into oncoming traffic, my cell phone rang, and it was Rebecca. She was on her way to the hospital to have her baby, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I was actually happy. She was in the labor room, strapped to a monitor when I got there, watching for her contractions. She barely noticed when I walked in, but didn't seem startled when I sat down beside her and took her hand in mine. I tried talking to her, but she was unresponsive, and I was so tired I didn't even realize I had started to drift off to sleep until the nurses came in and started moving her to the delivery room about a half hour later. I put on my scrubs and a hairnet and went in with her to hold her hand and coach her through like they trained us in Lamaze. When she started cursing and screaming, I was prepared for that. Oh, that's good. I was prepared for that. as well as her ever tightening grip on my hand. But when I saw the movement in her tummy, my mind started to reel. The doctor said the baby was crowning and told her to push. I echoed his orders and she screamed at me with a voice I couldn't even begin to describe. When I looked down at her, she was staring up at me with those same eyes I'd seen on the biker. The same eyes I thought I'd seen on Neil weeks before. I tried to jerk my hand away, but she maintained her grip. Black tar like blood Black tar like blood splashed the front of the doctor's scrubs, but he seemed to pay no heed. When I looked at her tummy again, and black veins seemed to stand out beneath her skin, pulsating. She continued to stare at me, and she was no longer screaming, just grinning, those obsidian eyes boring into me. To invoke the Nesberian hive mind of chaos, she breathed in a raspy voice. He who waits behind the wall, the doctor continued as he stared down at the child, my child, lying silently, cradled in his blood-stained hands. And he looked up and raised the baby, and it appeared to be covered in oozing, inky black liquid, much like that had been covered Neil a couple weeks prior. It did not cry out, but it was alive, and it moved when he held it up. When his eyes opened, they were as black as my wife's, as black as the doctor's. In unison, they all breathed his name, Zalgo. I ripped my hand free of my wife's iron grip and stumbled out of the room, barreling into the nurses passing in the corridor just outside. When I stood up and looked back into the room, I could see the inky black tendrils seeming to extend from the doctor and my newborn across the floor to where I stood. I turned and ran down the hall to the elevator and slammed my finger into the buttons. When I looked back, the tendrils had come into the hallway. Yet, no one seemed to notice until it slithered over their feet and up their legs, at which point they abruptly stopped, turned, and looked at me with those same obsidian eyes. I abandoned my effort to call the elevator and broke into a panic run for the stairs. I ran down the 15 flights of stairs all the way to the lobby, tore out into the parking lot, hopped in my car, and started driving. I don't know where the heck I was going. I just had to get the heck away from there. I don't know if I'm going crazy. It certainly seems like it, but I just can't be around anyone I know anymore. They all have those same eyes, those same dead stares, and even my child. Oh God, my baby. I still saw those eyes staring at me from the cars beside me, and by some strange coincidence, the same biker from the previous Friday night at the bar pulled up beside me an hour away from the hospital and followed me for nearly 2 miles. He turned and stared at me, grinning. I couldn't see his eyes through the sunglasses this time, but I knew it was the same guy. His tattoos seemed to move of their own free will. The flaming skull on his right bicep began bleeding from his eye sockets. As soon as I could, I slammed on my brakes, allowing him to fly past me. As I swerved to my left and did a U-turn, I think I lost him. That was about an hour ago. I'm at a motel 3 hours out of town, the first place I found that has Wi-Fi, and I'm tired, and I'm shaking, and my hand itches where my wife's nails scratch me open. I honestly don't know what to do or who I can turn to. This story will sound insane, and I'll probably be institutionalized, and I'm not sure that wouldn't be the best thing for me, but I can't just bear to look into those eyes anymore. Every time I see someone new and they stare at me, I start to panic because I just know it's out there looking for me. And even when I lay down and start to drift to sleep, So this story didn't exactly give me an idea. Well, it gave me a sort of an idea of what Zalgo was, but the origin of Zalgo, it still makes everything more confusing. From what I know from Zalgo is that it's some sort of chaos-bringing entity that is able to corrupt things. Yes, I understand that, and that was shown in the section where it talked about the comic strips, but that doesn't explain why this was happening. Um, Now, I know it's a story. I probably shouldn't be thinking too deep into it, but then again, these questions are also being asked by me because I'm still confused. And another thing is like, was like, another thing is that Zalgo is this like a chaos entity, right? So was this man's child Zalgo? I'm confused by everything. I'm confused on how Zalgo crept into this man's life and I don't know, became their child. I feel like this story has a lot of things left unanswered, and I feel like that's the point of the story. Like you're not supposed to get a clear answer on why this happened. This is from the perspective of our narrator, the guy going through all this with his pregnant wife and whatnot, not through the perspective of Zalgo. So this story leaves a lot of things unanswered, and honestly, most stories like this do leave a lot of things unanswered. And some stories actually do give you explanations of what just happened. But with Zalgo, I'm gonna have to say is like I I know less about the character and more about have now more questions about the character. But without further ado, this has been the first episode of Tales Around the Fire, and I hope to see you all next time.